I haven't been touched gently in 16 years. That's what the big girl whispered, right before she kissed the stranger who'd just run off the men mocking her. In a winter town where snow bites the bone and gossip cuts deeper, one quiet freight hauler sees something no one else will admit: her worth. But kindness on the frontier comes with a price. And the price just arrived on horseback, wearing the railroad's badge of authority. The girl dreams of baking bread in her own shop. The man dreams of seeing her free of cruelty. Yet between them and that dream lies a paper lost, sold, maybe stolen, that could strip her of the only home she's ever known. The wind howls. Down Main Street, boots thud on the porch, and a legal notice flutters in the cold. A sale made in secret. A clause hidden in an old Bible. And the clock ticking before the railroad takes everything. Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story. 2. The bitter Colorado wind howled down Esperanza's Main Street, rattling shop signs and stirring loose snow into white clouds. Caleb Morrow's weathered hands gripped the reins of his mule team as they pulled his laden wagon to a stop outside the Mercantile. The leather harnesses creaked with familiar comfort as he set the brake and climbed down, his boots crunching in. The fresh powder dot inside the Mercantile, warmth from the pot-bellied stove wrapped around him like a blanket. Mr. Peterson, the owner, looked up from his ledger with a welcoming nod. "Much obliged for making it through this weather, Morrow. Them supplies is needed bad. Reckon folks need their flour and coal, storm or no storm." Caleb's voice was quiet but carried the weight of experience. Together, they unloaded the cargo, stacking sacks of flour near the counter and hauling coal to the storage shed out back. When the last load was stored, Caleb stepped back onto the street, adjusting his coat against the wind. That's when he heard them, the harsh voices and cruel laughter coming from the direction of Ma Hutter's boarding house. Three cowhands, their faces red with whiskey and cold, were jeering at a woman on the porch. She was larger than most frontier women, wrapped in a faded brown dress and wool shawl, trying to sweep snow from the wooden planks. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as if each gesture was a shield against their words. "Hey there, Hog Molly," one called out, swaying on his feet. "Ain't you got enough meat on them bones without adding more? Better watch that porch don't collapse," another added with a mean laugh. "Though I reckon you're good for heavy lifting, ain't nothing else." The woman's shoulders hunched forward, her grip tightening on the broom handle. But she kept sweeping, her face turned away from their taunts. Something in Caleb's chest tightened. Without conscious thought, his feet carried him forward, placing his broad frame between the woman and her tormentors. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, steady as an oak tree in the howling wind. The cowhands' laughter died in their throats. Caleb's presence, though quiet, carried the weight of countless miles and hard-won wisdom. His eyes, clear and stern, met theirs without wavering. "Evening, boys," he said finally, his tone mild but firm. "Might be time to head on home." The youngest cowhand opened his mouth as if to argue, but a sharp elbow from his companion silenced him. They shuffled off, muttering under their breath, their bravado deflated by Caleb's calm authority. When they were gone, Caleb turned to the woman. Up close, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her late 20s. Her eyes were the color of summer honey, though they regarded him with careful wariness. "Thank you," she said softly, "but you needn't have troubled yourself." "No trouble," Caleb replied. "Weather's fierce enough without adding meanness to it." She nodded, then seemed to remember her duties. "Please, come in where it's warm. Least I can do is offer you some coffee." Inside the boarding house kitchen, the aroma of fresh bread and coffee wrapped around them. "The woman Clara Beauchamp?" He learned from her quiet introduction. moved with surprising grace as she poured him a cup of strong coffee and a tin mug. Steam rose between them as she set the cup down, her eyes fixed on the worn tablecloth. Caleb noticed her hands, strong and capable, but trembling slightly as she stepped back. "Miss Beauchamp," he said gently, extending his hand across the table. "I'm much obliged for the coffee." She stared at his offered hand as if it were something foreign and strange. A mix of longing and fear crossed her face, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I haven't been touched gently in 16 years. The words hung in the warm kitchen air, heavy with years of pain and loneliness. Before Caleb could find the right words to answer, Clara leaned forward suddenly. Her lips brushed his cheek in. A kiss so quick and awkward it might have been imagined. Her face flushed deep red, and she stepped back quickly. "The stove needs tending," she mumbled, turning away. "Please ... enjoy your coffee." Caleb watched as she busied herself with the wood stove, her movements sharp and nervous now. He lifted the coffee to his lips, letting its warmth spread through him, while the ghost of that gentle kiss lingered on his cheek like a promise. The kitchen's warmth wrapped around them like a quilt as Caleb savored his coffee. Clara's movements were precise and careful as she tended the stove, stealing glances at him when she thought he wasn't looking. The comfortable silence between them shattered as Mrs. Beauchamp burst through the door, her skirt swishing against the wooden floor. "Well, if it isn't Mr. Morrow." Mrs. Beauchamp's voice dripped honey as she spotted him at the table. "Such a pleasure to have a respectable freight hauler grace our establishment." Her eyes darted to Clara, and her tone turned sharp as vinegar. "Clara, why are you dawdling by that stove? The dinner dishes won't wash themselves, girl." Clara's shoulders tensed, but she kept her eyes down. "Yes, Mother. I was just nothing. And look at this floor. It needs sweeping again. Honestly, child, sometimes I wonder if you'll ever learn to keep house properly." Through the window came a familiar voice. "Morrow, your payment's ready at the office." Caleb set down his empty cup, noting how Clara's fingers twisted in her apron. "Much obliged for the coffee, Mrs. Beauchamp." His eyes found Clara's. "I'm headed to Alamosa next week with supplies. Should be good earnings if the weather holds." Clara's mother brightened. "Alamosa! How exciting. Such opportunities for a man of your standing." But Caleb kept his attention on Clara. "Miss Beauchamp, if you had your choice, what would you do with such an opportunity?" The kitchen grew quiet save for the crackle of the stove. Clara's hand stilled on her apron, and for a moment she seemed to forget her mother's presence. "I've always dreamed of opening a bakery," she said softly. "I have all my grandmother's recipes, and people say my bread is the best in the county." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "But Mother keeps my wages for the boarding house debts." "And foolish girl," Mrs. Beauchamp cut in. "Who would want to buy bread from? I could help," Caleb said, his calm voice stopping Mrs. Beauchamp mid-sentence. "Part of my freight earnings could clear those debts. Give you a fresh start, Miss Beauchamp." Clara's honey-colored eyes widened, and a flush crept up her neck. Her mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Mr. Morrow," Clara whispered, "no man has ever. I mean, you barely know me ... The freight agent's voice called again, more insistent this time. "Think on it," Caleb said, rising from the table. "I'll return before sunset." As evening settled over Esperanza, the boarding house windows glowed with lamplight. Caleb finished his business at the freight office and returned to find Clara waiting by the kitchen door. She pressed a napkin-wrapped package into his hands, her fingers brushing his. "Fresh cornbread," she murmured, "to thank you for your kindness today." The bread was still warm, and its sweet aroma filled the air between them. Before Caleb could respond, hoofbeats echoed on the packed snow, and Sheriff Hanley's figure appeared in the gathering dusk. Evening, folks, the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. Got a notice here needs delivering. Caleb accepted the document, unfolding it in the yellow lamplight spilling from the kitchen. Clara moved closer, a shoulder nearly touching his as she peered at the paper. Mrs. Beauchamp appeared in the doorway behind them as Caleb read. His jaw tightened. Property seizure notice, he said grimly. Railroad's claiming the land for track expansion. Says you've got 3 weeks to vacate. What? Clara's voice cracked. But this is our home. Mother, didn't father have a land patent? Mrs. Beauchamp's face had gone pale. This is your doing. She spat at Caleb. Showing up here, filling her head with nonsense about bakeries, and now this. You're probably working with them railroad men. Mother, no, Clara protested. He was only trying to help. But Mrs. Beauchamp had already snatched the notice from Caleb's hands. Get off my property, Mr. Morrow, and don't come back. Clara stood frozen, the hope that had brightened her eyes all afternoon crumbling like day-old bread. She reached for the doorframe to steady herself, watching as her dreams of independence scattered like ashes in the winter wind. The sheriff cleared his throat uncomfortably. I'll just be going then. Good evening to you all. In the harsh lamplight, Clara's face was a mask of despair as she looked at Caleb one last time before her mother pulled her inside and slammed the door. Dawn painted the Esperanza sky in watercolor grays and frost to delicate patterns across the boarding house windows. Caleb's boots crunched through fresh snow as he approached the kitchen door, a paper-wrapped bundle of warm biscuits from the cafe tucked under his arm. His breath formed clouds in the crisp morning air. The door creaked open before he could knock. Clara stood there, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night, but her chin held high. She wore a simple brown dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned back. You came back, she whispered, stepping aside to let him in. The kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Mrs. Beauchamp sat at the table, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders, her face pinched with worry and anger. Caleb set the biscuits on the table. I've been thinking about that railroad notice, he said, removing his hat. Their claim might not be as solid as they want us to believe. If we can prove you've been living here continuous, and if we can find your father's land patent. Patent? Clara's hand stilled on the coffee pot she was lifting. Father did receive such a paper, years ago. I remember the day clearly. He was so proud, said it meant the land was truly ours. Mrs. Beauchamp's chair scraped against the floor. As she stood, that paper is long gone, she snapped. After your father passed, times were hard. I had to pawn it, along with other things. Pawned it? Caleb leaned forward. Where? Trinidad, Mrs. Beauchamp replied, her voice bitter. Carter's pawn shop. On Front Street. But it's pointless now. That was 3 years ago. Clara's eyes met Caleb's. Could it still be there? Only one way to find out. Caleb squared his shoulders. I'm headed that direction anyway with my freight run. Trinidad's a 2-day journey, weather permitting. Mrs. Beauchamp, if you'd come along, leave my boarding house? In winter? Mrs. Beauchamp laughed sharply. I think not, Mr. Morrow. Some of us have responsibilities. Clara took a deep breath. I'll go. The kitchen fell silent. Mrs. Beauchamp's face darkened like a thundercloud. You most certainly will not. Gallivanting across the territory with a man you barely know? What would people say? People already say plenty, Mother. Clara's voice was quiet but firm. I spent all night praying about this. If there's even a chance to save our home, I have to try. Caleb nodded slowly. My wagon's well supplied, and I know every mile between here and Trinidad. You'll be safe with me, Miss Beauchamp. Clara, Mrs. Beauchamp pleaded. Be sensible. You've never traveled more than 10 miles from Esperanza. The road is dangerous. So is losing everything we Have. Clara untied her apron and hung it on its peg. I'll pack my things. An hour later, Caleb helped Clara into the wagon. She had changed into her warmest dress and wrapped herself in a heavy shawl. In the back, they'd loaded blankets, a coffee pot, extra feed for the mules, and a small carpet bag containing Clara's belongings that Mrs. Beauchamp watched from the porch, her arms crossed. "Don't expect me to hold your position here if you go," she called out. Clara's hands trembled as she adjusted her shawl, but her voice was steady. "I understand, Mother." Caleb clicked to the mules, and the wagon wheels began to turn. Clara twisted. In her seat, watching the boarding house grow smaller. The building had been her whole world for so long, every window, every creaking floorboard as familiar as her own reflection. Now she didn't know if she would ever sleep beneath its roof again. The road curved through snow-dusted foothills, leaving Esperanza behind. Pine trees stood like sentinels along the way, their branches heavy with white. The cold air nipped at Clara's cheeks, but it felt clean and fresh in her lungs, so different from the close air of the kitchen. "You're very brave," Caleb said quietly, adjusting the reins. Clara watched her breath mist in the winter air. "I don't feel brave. I feel ... double quotes." She paused, searching for the right words. "I feel like a bird that's been in a cage so long, it's forgotten how to fly." "Well," Caleb replied, a gentle smile touching his eyes. "Seems to me you're spreading your wings just fine." The wagon creaked onward, following the winding road toward Trinidad and whatever fate awaited them there. Above, the gray sky stretched endless and free, promising change on the horizon. The winter sun hung pale in the sky as Caleb guided the wagon along the frozen river crossing. Ice-crusted branches reached over the rutted road, their shadows making lacy patterns on the snow. Clara huddled deeper into her shawl, watching how carefully Caleb handled the reins. "Winter travel's different from summer hauling," he explained, his voice steady over the creak of wagon wheels. "Can't stop as often, and when we do, it's gotta count. Every minute in the cold takes its toll on man and beast alike." Clara nodded, noting how the mule's breath steamed in the frigid air. "How do you know where it's safe to rest?" "Line shacks, mostly. Trappers build them along common routes." Caleb pointed ahead to a simple wooden structure nestled among the pines. "Speaking of which, that's our midday stop there." The small cabin looked weathered but solid. Caleb helped Clara down from the wagon, his movements measured and calm. She noticed how he never rushed, never made sudden gestures that might startle her. More telling was what he didn't do no grimace when the wagon springs creaked under her weight. No comments about her size like so many others felt free to make. Inside the line shack, Caleb cleared the stone hearth and built a small fire. Clara unpacked their coffee pot while he tended to the mules. The familiar ritual of making coffee steadied her nerves. When Caleb returned, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames and sipping the hot brew. "Much obliged," Caleb said, holding his tin cup with both hands to warm them. Nothing better than coffee on a cold day. A movement outside caught their attention. A rancher was working along his fence line, replacing broken posts in the frozen ground. Caleb watched him for a moment, then reached into their supplies. "Reckon we could spare some flour," he said, pulling out a small sack. "Man working in this? Weather could use extra provisions." Clara watched as Caleb approached the rancher. Their conversation carried on the clear winter air, Caleb offering the flour, the rancher gratefully trading some oats in return. More than the goods exchanged, Clara saw how the rancher's suspicious expression melted into respect at Caleb's quiet manner. They traveled until dusk painted the sky in deep purples and blues. The roadside inn appeared ahead, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. After settling the mules in the stable, they entered the inn's common room. A fire crackled in the hearth, and savory smells wafted from the kitchen. Over bowls of hot stew and fresh bread, Clara gathered her courage. "May I ask about your life before? You seem to know every mile of this territory." Caleb set down his spoon, his eyes growing distant. "Been hauling freight for 15 years now. Started with my wife, Sarah. We worked these routes together until—" He paused, running a hand over his face. "Fever took her 5 years back. Doctors couldn't do anything." Clara's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "How did you bear it?" "Faith," he answered simply. "Without that anchor, bitterness would have eaten me alive. I had to trust that God had a purpose, even when I couldn't see it." He looked at her directly. "What about you? What keeps you going through all the unkindness you've faced?" Clara's fingers twisted in her napkin. "Prayer, mostly. Every night, I ask for someone who can look at me and see ... She swallowed hard. "See me, not just my size. Someone who won't mock or judge." "I see you, Clara," Caleb said softly, his gaze warm and steady. "I see a woman of courage and dignity. Someone who's endured more than her share of cruelty without letting it harden her heart." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. In all her 27 years, no one had spoken to her with such genuine respect. She recognized in Caleb's loneliness an echo of her own, the ache of moving through a world that seemed to have no place for them. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more past the tightness in her throat. Caleb nodded, understanding in his eyes. They finished their meal in companionable silence, the fire's warmth and their shared confidences creating a pocket of peace in the winter night. Dawn brought no relief from winter's grip. Clara woke to the sound of wind whistling through the inn's eaves and the soft patter of snow against frosted window panes. In the common room, the innkeeper stood at the window, shaking his head at the white curtain falling outside. "Ain't fit weather for traveling," he warned, turning to face Caleb and Clara as they came down for breakfast. "Storms blown in from the mountains. Could last days by the look of those clouds." Caleb studied the leaden sky through the window while finishing his porridge. "Much obliged for the warning, but we need to make Trinidad soon as possible." He glanced at Clara. "That is, if you're willing to brave it." Clara squared her shoulders. "I've come too far to turn back now." They wrapped themselves in extra layers before venturing out. Clara wound a thick wool scarf around her face, leaving only her eyes visible. Caleb helped her into the wagon, making sure the blankets were tucked securely around her legs. The mules stamped impatiently, their breath freezing in the air. The wagon wheels squealed against the frozen ruts as they left the inn behind. Snow fell steadily, coating everything in white. Clara watched Caleb's sure handling of the reins, noting how he tested each stretch of road before letting the mules proceed at full weight by afternoon. The storm intensified. The wind drove snow horizontally across their path, and visibility dropped to mere yards ahead. Clara could barely make out the mules' ears through the swirling white. "Can't risk going much further," Caleb called over the wind. "There's a line shack about a quarter mile ahead. We'll shelter there until this passes." Asterisk, before Clara could protest further, Caleb was counting bills onto the counter. She watched in dismay, knowing it must be most of his freight earnings money he'd earned through weeks of hard winter hauling. The proprietor scooped up the cash, and Clara took the document with trembling hands. Inside the case, her father's careful signature sprawled across the bottom of the patent, the official seal still clear after all these years. "Caleb, I can't let you," she began, but he shook his head. "Already done," he said simply. "Let's find lodging before dark." They found rooms at a modest boarding house near the edge of town. The landlady raised an eyebrow at their travel-worn appearance, but softened when Caleb explained they'd been caught in the storm. She offered Clara a small room at the back of the house, warm and clean if plain. "I'll bed down in the stable," Caleb said, gathering his blankets from the wagon. "That's not the cause talk." Clara watched from her window as he crossed the yard to the stable, his figure dark against the snow. The land patent lay on her small bed, its presence both a victory and a reminder of his sacrifice. She traced her father's signature with one finger, remembering his hands guiding hers as she learned to shape bread dough, teaching her to trust her own judgment. Sleep was long in coming that night, her mind full of the day's journey, the recovered patent, and the quiet way Caleb had paid such a price without hesitation. The shack appeared like a ghost through the snowfall, its dark walls a welcome sight. Caleb quickly unhitched the mules and led them to the lean-to beside the cabin. Inside, the shack was cold but sound, with a small stone fireplace and stack of dry wood along one wall. While Caleb tended to the animals, Clara swept old ashes from the hearth and started a fire. The flames caught quickly, but the winter wind found every crack in the wooden walls. Working together, they hung blankets over the windows and across the room's center, creating a smaller space to heat. "That's clever thinking," Caleb said, watching Clara pin the last blanket in place. "Keeps the warmth where we need it most." Clara smiled, pleased by his approval. "My father taught me about surviving winter storms. He said small spaces heat faster than large ones." The mention of her father softened her expression. As they sat down to a simple stew of dried beef and beans, Clara found herself sharing memories that had long been locked away. "Papa loved to bake," she said, stirring her bowl thoughtfully. "He'd let me help on Sunday mornings, teaching me how to measure flour just so, how to tell when the dough was ready by its feel. Sod, I had a natural talent for it." She paused, running her finger along the rim of her bowl. "Those were the happiest times I can remember." Caleb listened intently, his eyes warm in the firelight. He pulled a folded paper from his coat and spread it on the floor between them. "While we wait out the storm, let me show you our route to Trinidad." His finger traced lines across the rough map. "We're here, near Pueblo. 2 days good travel should get us there, weather permitting. The pawn shop's on Commercial Street, according to what folks told me back in Esperanza." Wind rattled the shutters, making the blankets sway. The fire popped and hissed as snow found its way down the chimney. Clara watched Caleb add more wood to the flames, his movements careful and deliberate, even in such a simple task. As night settled in, Caleb arranged their bedrolls near the fire. He took the one furthest from the flames, offering Clara the warmer spot without comment. The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught in her throat. How long had it been since someone had put her comfort first? "Thank you," she said softly, hesitating, before accepting the better position. "Not just for this, but for ... She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had brought them to this moment. "No need for thanks," Caleb replied, his voice gentle. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another long day." Clara settled into her bedroll, listening to the storm's fury outside their shelter. The fire's warmth and Caleb's steady presence nearby made her feel safer than she had in years. Despite the howling wind, she found herself drifting into peaceful sleep, her father's beloved face and Caleb's quiet kindness mingling in her dreams. That morning brought sudden quiet as the storm spent its fury. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through gaps in the blankets, casting golden ribbons across the cabin's wooden floor. Outside, the world sparkled like diamonds had been scattered across every surface. Caleb already had coffee brewing when she emerged from her bedroll. "Storm's cleared out," he said, passing her a steaming cup. "Might have done us a favor, too. Cold this sharp usually means good traveling. Everything's frozen solid." He was right. Once they set out, the wagon wheels ran smooth over the frozen ruts, the mules' hooves finding firm purchase on the packed snow. Their breath frosted in clouds as they drove, But the sun's warmth took the bitter edge off the morning chill dot by mid-morning. They approached an old army post, its weathered walls rising against the brilliant blue sky. A sentry called out as they neared the gate, and Clara noticed Caleb's face brighten with recognition. "Thompson? That you up there?" Caleb called. The sentry leaned forward, squinting against the sun's glare. "Well, if it ain't Caleb Morrow. Still hauling freight across. God's creation? Special cargo today," Caleb replied, gesturing respectfully toward Clara. "Making for Trinidad fast as we can manage." The sentry Thompson climbed down from his post, his boots crunching in the snow. "You know about the old supply trail? Army ain't using it much these days, but it'll cut near a day off your journey. Runs south through the valley, comes out just west of Trinidad." Caleb turned to Clara. "It's rougher going, but the time saved might be worth it. Your choice." Clara straightened her shoulders. "I trust your judgment." Thompson wrote out a note of passage, then waved them through the post's southern gate. The trail was narrow but well-graded, winding through stands of pine and past frozen streams that glittered in the winter sun. They made good time, and as the sun began its westward slide, the scattered buildings of Trinidad came into view. Clara's eyes widened at the sight. The frontier town sprawled across the valley, steam rising from chimneys and mingling with smoke from the railroad yard. The noise hit her first, shouting teamsters, hammering from the blacksmith shops, the whistle of a distant locomotive. Then the smells: wood smoke, coal dust, fresh-baked bread, and horse manure all mixing in the cold air. "It's so ... much," she whispered, shrinking slightly in her seat. "Stay close to me," Caleb said quietly. "We'll find that pawn shop and be done before dark." They found the shop on the town's eastern edge, a narrow building with clouded windows and a faded sign. A bell jingled as they entered, and Clara had to wait for her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. Shelves crowded with oddments lined the wall's tools, watches, jewelry, and stacks of yellowed papers. The proprietor emerged from a back room, adjusting a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. "Help you folks? Looking for a land patent," Caleb said. "Pawn here about 8 years back. Beauchamp family out of Esperanza." The man's expression sharpened. "Beauchamp, you say?" He shuffled through a ledger, then disappeared into the back. Clara held her breath until he returned, holding a leather document case. "Still got it?" he said, laying it on the counter. "But price has gone up, considering how long it's been held." $20. Cash money. Clara's heart sank. The original loan had been $8. "That's more than double. Price is firm," the proprietor cut in. "Railroads buying up claims all through that territory. Document like this, well, it's worth more nowadays. Before Clara could protest further, Caleb was counting bills onto the counter. She watched in dismay, knowing it must be most of his freight earnings money he'd earned through weeks of hard winter hauling. The proprietor scooped up the cash, and Clara took the document with trembling hands. Inside the case, her father's careful signature sprawled across the bottom of the patent, the official seal still clear after all these years. "Caleb, I can't let you," she began, but he shook his head. "Already done," he said simply. Let's find lodging before dark." They found rooms in a modest boarding house near the edge of town. The landlady raised an eyebrow at their travel-worn appearance, but softened when Caleb explained they'd been caught in the storm. She offered Clara a small room at the back of the house, warm and clean if plain. "I'll bed down in the stable," Caleb said, gathering his blankets from the wagon. "Best not to cause talk." Clara watched from her window as he crossed the yard to the stable, his figure dark against the snow. The land patent lay on her small bed, its presence both a victory and a reminder of his sacrifice. She traced her father's signature with one finger, remembering his hands guiding hers as she learned to shape bread dough. teaching her to trust her own judgment. Sleep was long in coming that night, her mind full of the day's journey, the recovered patent, and the quiet way Caleb had paid such a price without hesitation. Morning sunlight blazed across the snow-covered street, turning Trinidad's modest buildings into glowing shapes against the crisp blue sky. Clara woke early, the unfamiliar bed and the excitement of yesterday's success making sleep impossible. She carefully tucked the land patent into her travel bag before heading down to breakfast. The boarding house kitchen was already warm from the cooking fire when she entered. Fresh coffee scented the air, and the landlady, Mrs. Peterson, bustled about preparing morning bread for her guests. Clara watched the practiced movements with appreciation, noting the way the woman handled her dough. Caleb came in from the stable, stamping snow from his boots. His face was fresh-washed, his dog hair still damp at the temples. "Morning," he said, settling at the kitchen table. "Mules are fed and ready whenever you are." Clara poured coffee for them both, then hesitated. Before speaking, "Mrs. Peterson, might I use your oven before we leave? I'd like to bake something for the journey home." The landlady paused in her work, studying Clara's face. "You bake, do you?" "Yes, ma'am. Been cooking at our boarding house since I was 12. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened. "Well then, oven's yours once this bread's done. Supplies are in the pantry. Just mark down what you use, and we'll settle up after." Clara felt her face flush with pleasure. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed baking these past few days. Soon she was elbow-deep in flour, working butter into dough with practiced movements. She made 3 pies: apple, dried berry, and a honey-sweetened dried peach she'd spotted in the pantry. Caleb spent the morning checking the wagon and mules, but she caught him watching through the kitchen window more than once. The sight of his quiet attention made her hands tremble slightly as she crimped the pie edges by noon. The pies were cooling on the windowsill, their rich aroma filling the kitchen. Clara packed them carefully in a wooden box, cushioned with clean straw. Mrs. Peterson refused payment for the supplies, saying the smell of good baking was payment enough. They loaded the wagon under the bright midday sun. Clara settled the pie box safely behind their seat, then turned to find Caleb standing close, his expression thoughtful. "Been thinking," he said quietly, "about what you said, wanting your own bakery." He paused, adjusting the mule's harness. What if ... what if we open one together? I could be a silent partner, help with deliveries and such. You'd be in charge of the baking, running things your way." Clara stared at him, her heart suddenly racing. In all her dreams of having her own shop, she'd never imagined having a partner, someone to share the work, the risk, the joy of creation. The thought of Caleb being that someone made her feel lightheaded with possibility. Before she could think better of it, Clara stepped forward, rose on her tiptoes, and pressed her lips firmly against his. The kiss was warm and sure, nothing like her shy peck in the boarding house kitchen days ago. When she pulled back, Caleb's eyes were wide with surprise, but his smile was bright enough to rival the sun on snow. "I reckon that's a yes?" he asked. Softly, Clara laughed, the sound startling her with its freedom. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." They set out with the sun still high, the wagon wheels crunching through fresh snow. The cold air stung Clara's cheeks, but she felt warmer than she had in years. Every few miles, she would glance at Caleb and find him already looking at her, his expression soft with something that made her breath catch as dusk approached. They made camp in a sheltered hollow near a stream. Caleb built a fire while Clara arranged their bedrolls closer together than they'd been before, but still proper. The flames caught quickly, sending sparks dancing up toward the emerging stars. Clara retrieved one of the pies, the apple, cut generous slices for them both. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the same tin cup of coffee. The night was crystal clear, stars pricking through the darkening sky like pinpricks in black velvet. "These are the best pies I've had since Sarah passed," Caleb said quietly, setting down his empty plate. "She'd have liked you, I think. She always said good food was a way of showing love." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the comparison. To his late wife, "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. The patent, the bakery idea, for seeing me as someone worth seeing." Caleb reached across the space between them and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers. Neither spoke for a long moment, watching the fire dance and listening to the soft sounds of the night settling around them. Something had shifted between them, as clear and bright as the stars overhead, and Clara felt her heart swell with a joy she'd almost forgotten was possible. The morning's bright promise faded as dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing with them a bitter wind that cut straight through Clara's woolen shawl. The mules plodded forward, their breath visible in steamy puffs, while Caleb kept a firm grip on the reins. The wagon creaked and swayed as gusts buffeted its sides. "Wind's picking up something fierce," Caleb said, squinting at the horizon. "Might need to give the mules a rest soon. They're fighting it hard." Clara nodded, clutching her travel bag closer. The precious land patent was safely tucked inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. Every mile seemed to crawl by, and her thoughts kept racing ahead to Esperanza, wondering what changes might have occurred in their absence. After another hour of struggling against the headwind, Caleb spotted a ranch house set back from the road. A weathered sign read, "Circle P Ranch," above the gate. He guided the wagon into the yard, where a young ranch hand emerged from the barn. "Much obliged if we could rest our mules a spell," Caleb called out. "This wind's wearing them down." The ranch hand, barely more than a boy with sun-bleached hair, nodded eagerly. "Sure thing, mister. Barn's got plenty of room." "You folks come from Trinidad way?" "That we did," Caleb replied, helping Clara down from the wagon. Her legs were stiff from the cold ride, and she steadied herself against his arm. Inside the barn, the wind's howl was muted. The ranch hand helped Caleb unhitch the mules, chattering as they worked. "You heading to Esperanza?" "Old Town's stirred up lately. Them railroad men been through yesterday, marking things out with their fancy equipment." Clara's heart jumped. She shared a worried look with Caleb. "Railroad men?" Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. "What sort of marking were they doing?" The ranch hand leaned against a stall door. "Survey crew, looked like. Boss was a mean-faced fellow named Crenshaw. Been telling everyone the rail line's coming through, no matter what. Said they'd start clearing land by week's end." Clara's hands began to tremble. "Caleb," she whispered, "that's sooner than we thought." "What if we'll make it?" he said firmly, though she could see the concern in his eyes. "Judge Price will be in his office first thing tomorrow. That patent's as legal as they come." They rested the mules for only half an hour before hitching up again. The wind hadn't lessened, but now urgency drove them forward. Caleb kept the mules at a steady pace, despite the weather, checking their progress against the sun's position dot as afternoon faded into evening. Clara watched the shadows lengthen across the snow-covered landscape. Normally, they would have made camp by now, but Caleb showed no signs of stopping. He'd hung their brass lantern from the wagon's front corner, its light swinging with each bump and rut in the road. "We can save near 2 hours if we push on through sunset," he explained, pulling his coat tighter. "Got enough moonlight to travel by, and I know this stretch of road well." Clara huddled closer to him on the wagon seat, sharing what warmth they could. The lantern's glow created a small circle of light around them, beyond which the winter night pressed close. Every creak of the wagon, every snort from the mules seemed amplified in the darkness. "What if we're too late?" she finally voiced her fear. "What if they've already They can't do anything without proper papers, Caleb interrupted gently. That's why we got the patent. Judge Price is a fair man. He won't let them steal your land without a proper hearing. Finally, well past nightfall, they made camp near the river. The water's rush provided a constant background to the night sounds, and the mules stamped their feet in the cold, steam rising from their backs as Caleb rubbed them down. Clara tried to help set up camp, but her hands shook so badly she could hardly manage the tent flaps. Caleb built up the fire larger than usual, banking it carefully against the wind. Try to get some sleep, he urged, spreading her bedroll close to the fire's warmth. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. But sleep wouldn't come. Clara lay awake, listening to the river's flow and the occasional snort from the mules. The fires. Flames cast dancing shadows on the tent walls, and her mind raced with worries. Would Judge Price help them? What if the railroad men had already started work? What would happen to her mother, to the boarding house, to all their plans? She heard Caleb shift in his bedroll nearby, and then his quiet voice. I can hear you thinking from here. I'm scared, she admitted softly. I know, but you're not alone anymore. Whatever comes tomorrow, we'll face it together. Clara wrapped her blanket tighter, trying to draw comfort from his words. But as the night hours crept by, she remained awake, watching the stars wheel overhead through the tent's smoke hole, counting the minutes until dawn. Snowflakes began drifting down in the pre-dawn darkness, dusting the frozen ground with a fresh layer of white. Clara huddled deeper into her blankets as Caleb broke camp, his movements quick and precise in the dim light. The mule's breath created clouds in the cold air as he hitched them to the wagon. Storm's coming in from the north, he said, helping Clara onto the wagon seat. We'll make better time if we start now, before it gets worse. They traveled in tense silence as the snow thickened, coating the road and muffling the wagon wheels. Clara clutched her bag, containing the land patent, her knuckles white with cold and worry. The familiar landmarks of home began appearing through the curtain of snow. The old lightning-struck oak, the crossing where the creek bent sharply, and finally, the church steeple of Esperanza rising against the gray sky. Relief flooded through Clara as they approached town. The afternoon light was already fading when they turned onto the main street, snow still falling steadily. But as they drew closer to the boarding house, that relief twisted into horror. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, splintered wood showing where it had been forced open. Clara's heart stopped as she saw familiar items scattered across the gym. Snow-dusted porch, her mother's rocking chair overturned, kitchen implements and bits of clothing strewn about like discarded rubbish. No, she whispered, stumbling down from the wagon before Caleb could help her. No, no, no. She rushed up the steps, Caleb close behind. Inside, the damage was worse. Tables were overturned, drawers pulled out and emptied. The parlor where she'd served countless meals lay in disarray, chairs broken and cushions slashed. But worst of all was the silence. No fire in the hearth, no smell of cooking from the kitchen, no sound of her mother's voice. "Mama?" Clara called out, her voice echoing in the empty rooms. "Mama, where are you? Hold up there." Sheriff Hanley's voice rang out from the doorway. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. His expression was uncomfortable but firm. "Mrs. Beauchamp ain't here, Clara. She left yesterday." "Left?" Clara's voice cracked. "What do you mean, left? This is our home." The sheriff shifted his weight, not quite meeting her eyes. "Not anymore, it ain't. Your mother sold the property to the railroad, signed all the papers proper and legal, claiming full ownership rights. Took a good price for it, too, from what I heard." Clara felt the room spin. But we have the land patent. My father's name. Don't matter none without your mother's consent, Hamley cut in. She was listed as sole owner after your pa passed. Railroad's got legal claim now. Caleb stepped forward, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Sheriff, you know this ain't right. Clara's lived here her whole life. Her father meant this place for her. What's right don't always match what's legal," Hamley replied. His tone softened slightly. "Look, I'm giving you friendly warning. Railroad crews coming tomorrow to start demolition. Best clear out quiet-like before they have to evict you formal." Clara barely heard the rest of their conversation. She moved through the ransacked rooms like a sleepwalker, touching familiar walls, the worn banister, the kitchen door frame where her father had marked her height as a child. Each step felt like walking through deep water, her body heavy with disbelief. The kitchen was eerily still. No fire burned in the stove where she baked countless loaves of bread. The cupboard doors gaped open, shelves stripped bare. Even her precious recipe box was gone. She sank onto a kitchen chair, one of the few pieces of furniture still upright, and stared at nothing. Caleb's boots creaked on the floorboards as he approached. "Clara," he said softly, "we'll figure something out." "I promise you, don't." She interrupted, turning away from his outstretched hand. "Just don't." The snow continued falling outside the window, covering the scattered belongings on the porch in a blank white shroud. Clara sat motionless in the gathering darkness, feeling as hollow as the empty house around her. The land patent she'd fought so hard to recover lay useless in her bag, as worthless now as yesterday's newspaper. Through the kitchen window, she could see Caleb speaking with Sheriff Hanley out front, their figures dark against the swirling snow. The sheriff mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Caleb standing alone in the deepening twilight. He looked up at the house, at her window, but Clara couldn't bear to meet his gaze. She turned away, retreating deeper into the shadows of the empty kitchen, where the memories of happier days seemed to mock her present desolation. Caleb stood in the doorway of the ransacked boarding house, watching Clara run her fingers along the familiar wallpaper one last time. Snow drifted through the broken door, settling on the floor like scattered sugar. The day's last light was fading fast, and they needed shelter for the night. "Clara," he said gently, "I've got a proposition for you." He stepped closer, his boots creaking on the wooden floors. "The wagon's yours if you want it. And I've got flour enough stored in Trinidad to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe Denver, or even Kansas City." Clara turned from the wall, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "More charity?" Her voice was bitter, unlike anything he'd heard from her before. "God's been mighty free with false hopes lately. First the land patent, then—" She gestured helplessly at the space between them. "This ain't charity," Caleb said firmly. "It's investment in someone I believe in." Asterisk. But Clara was already shaking her head. "I believe too. Prayed every night of our journey. Look where that got me." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold something broken together. "I can't take any more kindness just to have it snatched away." The cafe owner, Martha Wilson, found them there as darkness fell. She took one look at Clara's face and insisted they come home with her. "Got a spare room upstairs," she said, brooking no argument. Better than freezing in this empty shell. The spare room was small but warm, with two narrow beds separated by a faded curtain. Martha provided soup and bread, then left them to settle in. Caleb took the bed nearest the door, leaving Clara the one by the window. Neither spoke as they prepared for sleep. In the darkness, Caleb lay still, sending up silent prayers for guidance, for Clara's heart to heal, for some way to make this right. The floorboards above creaked as Martha moved about, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked at the falling snow. On the other side of the curtain, Clara stared at the ceiling, counting Caleb's kindnesses like bitter treasures. The way he'd stood between her and those drunk cowboys, his offer to pay her mother's debts. The careful way he'd helped her into the wagon each morning of their journey, never commenting on her size. the warmth in his eyes when she baked those pies in Trinidad. Every memory felt like a knife now. What good was kindness when it led nowhere? What use was hope when it crumbled like dry earth in your hands? She turned her face to the wall, refusing to let tears fall. Dawn came too soon, gray light seeping through frosted window panes. They were sharing Martha's coffee when they heard the wagons arriving outside. Clara's hands began to shake so badly she had to set her cup down. The railroad foreman, Elijah Crenshaw, burst in without knocking. Snow fell from his coat as he stomped his boots. "Building needs to be cleared by noon," he announced, not bothering with greetings. "My men will start loading furniture now." He glanced at Clara with cold efficiency. "Whatever's not claimed gets burned." Clara made a small sound, like something breaking inside her chest. Caleb was on his feet instantly. "Now hold on," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "The lady needs time to sort through her belongings proper." Crenshaw's face hardened. "Time's up. We've got a schedule to keep." He turned and shouted through the door. "Start with the parlor boys. Everything goes." 4 men trooped in, heading straight for the boarding house. Clara stood frozen as they began carrying out chairs and tables, stacking them roughly in their wagon. When they reached for her father's writing desk, Caleb moved between them and the furniture. "That desk stays put till the lady decides where it goes," he said. The workers looked to Crenshaw, who had followed them in. "Move aside, Morrow," Crenshaw ordered, "or I'll have the sheriff remove you." "Sheriff ain't here," Caleb replied evenly. "And that desk belonged to Clara's father. It deserves better than being tossed around like firewood." The workers shifted uncomfortably, hands still on the desk. Snow continued to drift through the open door, melting on the floorboards. Clara watched the scene as if from a great distance, feeling everything she'd ever loved slipping away like water through her fingers. Crenshaw stepped closer to Caleb, his voice low and hard. "You're just delaying the inevitable. This building's coming down today, with or without your cooperation. Then we'll take all the time you've got," Caleb answered, planting his feet more firmly. "Every minute means one more thing saved proper." Clara looked between them, Caleb standing straight and steady as a mountain, Crenshaw rigid with frustrated authority, the workers awkwardly holding the desk between them. In that moment, she felt the full weight of their defeat. All their hopes, the journey to Trinidad, the recovered land patent, Caleb's unwavering support, all of it had led here to this final losing battle in an empty house filling with snow. Clara stumbled through the snow back to the boarding house, her boots leaving uneven tracks. Inside, the railroad men continued their methodical dismantling of her life. She pressed her back against the kitchen wall, watching them cart out chairs and tables, feeling more powerless with each passing minute. Her eyes drifted to the shelf, where her father's old Bible sat untouched. Mama had always said it was too worn to be worth anything, but Papa had read from it every evening. Clara crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and pulled it down, dust falling from its cracked leather cover. The familiar smell of old paper and candle wax brought tears to her eyes. She opened it carefully, remembering how Papa's rough hands had turned these same pages. As she leafed through the tissue-thin sheets, something slipped from between Psalms and Proverbs, a folded document, yellow with age but still crisp. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The paper was covered in precise legal writing, with her father's signature clear at the bottom beside an official notary seal. Clara's heart began to pound as she read the words. Any sale or transfer of said property must bear the written consent of all living heirs, else be rendered null and void. She read it again, hardly daring to breathe. Papa had added this clause after the Hendersons lost their land. She remembered him talking about it now. He'd wanted to protect them all from exactly what her mother had just done. "Caleb." Her voice cracked as she called out, "Caleb, come quick." He appeared in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. Clara thrust the paper toward him, her fingers shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Papa had it added. Look. Caleb read the document once, then again more slowly. His expression shifted from confusion to understanding to determination. Without a word, he strode to where his coat hung by the door and shrugged it on. Stay here, he said, already heading for the door. I'm writing for Judge Price's office in Cedar Creek. But the storm, Clara started to protest. Won't stop me, Caleb. Cut in. His eyes met hers, steady and sure. Trust me, Clara. Just keep them from destroying anything important till I return. He was gone before she could say more, the door banging shut behind him. Through the window, she watched him mount up and spur his horse into a gallop, snow swirling around him until he disappeared into the white haze. The next hour stretched like molasses in winter. Clara paced the cafe kitchen where Martha had insisted she wait, jumping at every sound from outside. The old clock on the wall seemed to mock her with its slow ticking. She tried to pray, but could only manage, "Please, Lord," over and over. Martha kept her supplied with coffee and tried to distract her with talk of spring plantings and new recipes. But Clara's mind was on Caleb, imagining him fighting through the storm, praying he'd reach the judge in time. The railroad men's voices drifted across from the boarding house, punctuated by the thud of furniture being moved. She went to the window every few minutes, straining to see through the falling snow. Each time, Martha gently steered her back to the kitchen table. Wearing out the floorboards won't bring him any faster, she said kindly. That man knows what he's about. Have faith. Clara pressed her hands flat against the rough wooden table, trying to still their trembling. The document was folded carefully in her apron pocket, and she touched it occasionally to remind herself it was real. Papa had known, had planned for this very thing. Even now, years after his passing, he was still protecting her. Tell me about when you first came here, Martha said, setting a fresh cup of coffee before her. About your father building that place. Clara seized gratefully on the distraction. She spoke of watching Papa lay the foundation stones, of helping Mama hang curtains in every window, of the first boarders they'd welcomed, and how Papa had insisted on reading from his Bible in the parlor every evening, boarders welcome to join, or not as they pleased. The memories helped calm her racing heart, but her eyes still darted to the window with every passing minute. Somewhere out there, Caleb was fighting through the storm for her. She'd never had anyone fight for her before, not since Papa died. The thought brought fresh tears, which she brushed away impatiently. He'll make it, Martha said softly, reaching across the table to pat Clara's hand. That man's got more determination than sense sometimes, but he'll make it. Clara managed a weak smile. I never thought anyone would ... She trailed off, unable to put into words all that Caleb had come to mean to her. I know, child, Martha replied. The Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he sends us exactly what we need, even if it comes wrapped in snow and hauling freight. Clara touched the document in her pocket again, feeling its crisp edges through the fabric. All she could do now was wait and pray and trust that Papa's foresight and Caleb's determination would be enough to save her home. Caleb's horse stumbled through knee-deep snow as they approached Cedar Creek. The courthouse windows glowed like beacons through the swirling white. His fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the reins as he dismounted. Inside, warmth from a pot-bellied stove hit him like a wave. The clerk looked up, startled. Judge Price still here? In his chambers, but Caleb was already striding past, boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. He rapped twice on the judge's door, then pushed it open without waiting. Judge Price glanced up from his desk, silver eyebrows rising. Mr. Morrow? What brings you out in this weather? This, Your Honor. Caleb pulled the claws from inside his coat, where he kept it dry against his chest. His hand shook slightly as he laid it on the desk. The Beauchamp boarding house. Mrs. Beauchamp sold it to the railroad this morning without her daughter's consent. But this document requires all heirs to approve any sale. The judge picked up the paper carefully, adjusting his spectacles. Indeed it does. He studied it closely in the lamplight. However, I'll need to verify these signatures. The notary's mark appears genuine, but in matters of property, ... How long? Caleb asked, trying to keep the urgency from his voice. Several hours at least. The railroad men are already taking possession? Caleb nodded grimly. Then wait here. I'll have my clerk bring coffee. The judge pulled out thick ledgers and began comparing marks and dates. The hours crawled by. Caleb paced, sat, stood again. His wet clothes steamed in the office heat. Outside, darkness fell. Early under the heavy clouds. Finally, as the courthouse clock struck 5, Judge Price looked up. The clause is valid. The sale is void without Miss Beauchamp's consent. He began writing rapidly. Here's the ruling. The railroad must cease and desist immediately. Thank you, Your Honor. Caleb's voice was rough with relief. He tucked the papers safely away and hurried out into the storm. The ride back was brutal. Ice formed on his beard, and he lost feeling in his feet. Only the thought of Clara kept him pushing forward through the darkness. It was well past 9. When he finally saw Esperanza's lights, his horse's head drooped with exhaustion as they approached the cafe. The door flew open. Clara stood there, lamplight behind her, face streaked with tears. Caleb? He nearly fell dismounting. His legs were so numb. We won, he managed through chattering teeth. The sale's void. Your home is safe. Clara rushed forward, catching his frozen hands in her warm ones. They stood there in the swirling snow, fingers interlocked, neither able to speak past the emotion, choking their throats. Everything that needed saying passed between their clasped hands and swimming eyes. The winter sun rose earlier now, painting the boarding house windows with golden light. Clara watched from the porch as the last railroad wagon disappeared around the bend. No more surveyor's stakes marked her land. No more threats darkened her doorstep. She clutched her broom tighter, allowing herself a small smile. Inside, the worn floorboards gleamed from hours of scrubbing. She had mended every torn curtain, patched every loose wallpaper seam, until the old place felt truly hers again. The front room, once cluttered with dusty chairs, now held promise. Reckon this'll do nicely, Caleb said, helping her position. The heavy wood-burning oven they'd bought second-hand from the closing cafe 2 towns over. His steady hands guided the iron beast into place as Clara watched, calculating angles for baking trays. The counter came next, solid oak with a glass display case. Clara ran her fingers over the smooth surface, imagining rows of fresh pies cooling there. She'd saved every penny from her boarding house work, and with Caleb's silent partnership, her dream was taking shape. That first morning, she rose before dawn to bake. The scent of cinnamon and butter drifted down the street, drawing curious townsfolk. Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile was first, eyeing the golden-crusted apple pies. Never thought to see such changes here, she said, but her tone held warmth instead of criticism. She bought 2 pies and spread the word. By noon, half the display case stood empty. Clara's cheeks flushed with pride as she counted the day's earnings. When Sheriff Hanley tipped his hat and praised her biscuits, she stood straighter, no longer shrinking from attention. Each morning, Caleb arrived as the sun crested the hills. He'd settle at the small table by the window, sipping coffee while Clara worked. Some days, he stayed an hour, others longer, watching her confident movements with quiet admiration. Asterisk. Mighty fine place you've made here, he said one morning, helping himself to a second cup. Folks are saying your pies beat anything this side of Denver. Clara paused in her kneading, flour dusting her arms. It's different now, she said softly. When people look at me, they see what I can do, not just ... She gestured at herself. They see you, Caleb finished simply. She nodded, joy warming her chest. Through the window, she watched townspeople greeting each other, stopping the chat before entering her shop. No more cruel jokes echoed down the street. No more sideways glances or whispered mockery. She had carved out her own place here, earned their respect with every loaf and pie. The morning light caught the glass display case, making the fresh pastries glow like treasure. Clara smiled, dusting more flour on her rolling pin. She had work to do. Spring sunlight streamed through the bakery windows, casting warm patterns across the flour-dusted counter. Clara worked the morning's bread dough with practiced hands, her movements steady and sure. The familiar rhythm of kneading had become a comfort, like a prayer set to motion. The bell above the door chimed softly. She didn't need to look up to. No, it was Caleb. His footsteps had their own quiet melody on her wooden floors. But something felt different in his pause, in the way he stood watching her work. Morning, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face with her forearm. Caleb stepped closer, his presence warm and solid beside her. Without a word, he reached for her flour-covered hand. Her fingers stilled in the dough as he gently turned her palm upward. Into that work-worn hand, he placed something small and cool. Clara's breath caught as she saw the glint of gold nestled in her floury palm, a simple ring that caught the morning light like a captured star. You've been touched gently, Caleb said, his voice low and sure. Now be cherished. Clara looked up, her vision blurring with tears that made the sunlight dance. In his steady gaze, she saw every moment that had led them here, his quiet defense that first winter day, the long journey through snow, the countless mornings of coffee and understanding. She saw herself as he did, strong, worthy, beloved. Her nod was small but certain, like a key turning in a long locked door. Outside, children's laughter rang clear as they chased each other down the awakening street. The smell of baking bread drifted through the open window, mingling with the fresh spring air. Clara could hear Mrs. Peterson greeting the mercantile owner, their voices warm with morning gossip. Caleb moved to his usual spot at the counter, same as he had every morning since the bakery opened. Clara poured his coffee in the blue cup she'd come to think of as his. Steam rose between them as they sat together, but now their hands found each other across the wooden surface, fingers intertwined, the small gold ring a promise between them. They didn't need many words. The morning sun painted everything in honey gold light, and the ring caught fire in it, throwing tiny sparks across their joined hands. Clara felt the weight of years of loneliness lifting like morning mist, replaced by something stronger, something built of quiet loyalty and patient love. The bread would need shaping soon, and customers would begin arriving for their morning pastries. But for now, they sat in the peaceful light, their coffee cooling between them, their hands clasped in silent promise. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.